Markley.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise with a few questions for the chair of the Judiciary Committee, after which I'll have some comments on this nomination.
Senator Doyle, prepare yourself. Senator Markley, proceed, sir.
Thank you, Madam President. If I may ask through you, Senator Doyle, were you on the Judiciary Committee during the Rowland administration when Judges Mengachi and Robertson had hearings?
Senator Doyle.
Through you, Madam President, the answer is yes.
Senator Markley.
Thank you, Madam President. May I ask through you if they were questioned about their friendship with Governor Rowland?
Senator Doyle.
Through you, Madam President. That's an interesting question. My memory is not crystal clear, but I believe there were some mentions with candidate Mengachi, but I'll be honest, I'm not certain of that. Memory is not crystal clear. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Markley.
Thank you, Madam President, and I sympathize with the senator. It is a little while ago. Let me ask if his memory includes this. Through you, Madam President. Senator Doyle, do you remember what the disposition was of those nominations?
Senator Doyle.
Through you, Madam President, the answer is yes.
Senator Markley.
And may I ask through you, Madam President, what it was?
Senator Doyle.
Both candidates were not approved. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Markley.
Thank you, Madam President. That's all I wanted to ask the chair, and I appreciate his responses. I do want to say a few words about something that I think is a very vexed issue, which is our proper role in confirming judicial nominations. Senator Doyle, again, did an excellent job at the beginning of this debate in summarizing the guidance that we have in our state constitution from the American Bar Association and other places. I can't really speak to this as a state issue. I guess I know it a little bit as a federal issue. And viewed historically, I'd say our oversight of executive nominations generally is something that has changed over the years, but not necessarily evolved. I think it's safer to say that it's oscillated. There's a story that when George Washington brought his very first nominations to the U.S. Senate, some diplomats that he was going to appoint. He came in person to the Senate chamber and handed them to the president, and then stood there waiting for them to vote on them so he could just go back to the White House with the nominations approved. And when, in fact, the president of the Senate assigned the nominations to a committee for further review, President Washington left in a huff, insulted that his nominations weren't taken up and approved immediately, because it wasn't clear what the relationship was supposed to be. And it's a relationship, again, as I've said, that has changed over the years. You know, Chief Justice Marshall is probably the most respected jurist in our nation's history. But he was one of the midnight appointments of President John Adams shortly before he left office, I think within 2 months of the end of his term, after he had already lost election. And President Thomas Jefferson, a man one would have to say with as great respect for the Constitution and the function of government as anyone, having had a hand in so much of the formation of our government, did all he could to encourage the impeachment of Justice Marshall, not for anything that he had done in office, but merely because of the political positions that Marshall held and the disagreement that he had with Jefferson. There have been moments in our history of contention like that over these sorts of appointments. There's also been long periods of eras of good feeling, one might say. I think I was born into one. I can remember in the 60s and the 70s that judicial nominations, absent ethical questions, as occurred occasionally, or questions of competence, generally went through without by overwhelming votes. That changed, if it changed at any point, with Robert Bork back in 1987 when he was appointed by Ronald Reagan. Democratic senators previously had said things very favorable about Robert Bork based on his superb intellect and his faultless record. But in the end, they opposed him and rejected his nomination because of his judicial philosophy. And let me say, I don't disagree with them doing so. I think that we all have to work our way towards finding the grounds on which we make these judgments, that it's not something that's predetermined for us. 5 years ago, when I spoke on this nomination, I said I felt that there were three criteria by which I would judge Andrew McDonald's fitness for this spot. The first one I'll take up is experience. And certainly that situation has changed in the intervening 5 years. At the time he first came before us, he was beginning his judicial career at the very top as a Supreme Court justice. That's not unique, but I did not think that it was an advantage for him as a nominee, and I question that. He's now had 5 years' experience on the Supreme Court, and I think that question, on one hand, is less pointed. On the other hand, as Senator Fasano pointed out, as Chief Justice, Andrew McDonald would become the chief administrator of the entire court system. And I think it could only be held to be an advantage to have moved up through that system, as almost every Chief Justice and almost every Justice of the Supreme Court has. So, although I don't think his experience is disqualifying, I don't consider it a recommendation. A second criteria, as I said at the time, is judicial philosophy. I think that on that ground, I have always been troubled by the nomination of Andrew McDonald, because he has a long record as a legislator to tell us, even before his nomination, what his judicial philosophy was. Senator Fasano has spoken on this more expertly than I can, and I expect that others may do so as well. But let me mention two issues that particularly concern me, and not in great depth, but one is the death penalty. Justice McDonald's involvement in this issue is tangled and fraught to my mind. As a legislator, he was an aggressive proponent of repeal of the death penalty. Then he served as chief counsel to Governor Malloy at the time that a repeal of the death penalty was being drafted. And then he was appointed to the bench and was one of the majority which, on reviewing that legislation, found it unconstitutional. And in defiance of the clear intent of the General Assembly, eliminated the death penalty in our state altogether. Given his history of advocacy on this issue, and given the reasonable question of his possible involvement in the creation and the passage of the legislation which repealed the death penalty, it seems clear to me that he should have recused himself from that decision and not participate in a decision which not only struck down the bill that was before him for review, but the entire possibility of a death penalty in Connecticut, going far beyond what was required for the court to do at that point. Worse to my mind was the bill which was raised by the Judiciary Committee when Senator McDonald chaired it, which would have changed the governance structure of the Catholic Church. I am not now, and I never have been, a Catholic, but I'm deeply offended by any assault on the free operation of a religious institution in the state of Connecticut. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, I had the chance to question Justice McDonald on this issue, and he dismissed the bill as a request that came from a constituent and with language in it which he himself had not closely examined. I don't disbelieve him, but frankly, I find it difficult to believe him. I've sat myself in many bill screenings over the years, and I don't think on the drowsiest afternoon a bill concerning the governing structure of the Catholic Church would have passed by me without review. And I certainly find it hard to believe that a man with as sharp a mind and as good a political instinct as Andrew McDonald has would not have looked at the language of a bill which tread on so sensitive a topic. John McKinney said at the time that happened that it was a mistake that a first-year law student would be ashamed to make. We have to assume that either it was through indifference or ill feeling that mistake was made. The third criteria, and again that Senator Doyle mentioned explicitly, is temperament. And 5 years ago when I spoke about Andrew McDonald, I said I knew and had heard nothing against him on those grounds. The affidavit which was sworn by one of our Senate colleagues concerning the behavior of Andrew McDonald was disturbing news to me. The purpose of that affidavit was to create grounds for Justice McDonald to recuse himself from a case which was before him. Again, there is no question in my mind, based on what was in that affidavit, that the recusal would have been appropriate. But I have to say it's the behavior which was described itself which horrifies me. I may be naive. I don't feel naive, but maybe I am naive. Or maybe I've been lucky. But in nearly a decade that I've been in this building, I have never seen behavior like that. And I've never even heard behavior like that reported. A verbal assault which was so alarming to the people who witnessed it that they came up to the senator afterwards and asked if she was all right. I don't know what the people watching, the people outside of this building, think about how we do business here. But thank goodness that's not how we do business here. And that a man acting on behalf of the governor of Connecticut would treat anyone like that in public, whether it's a legislator or a lunchroom worker, amazes me. And that the governor would accept such behavior from somebody acting on his behalf and reward it with nomination to the highest post in our judiciary astonishes me. And for these reasons which I have stated, I am convinced that this nomination was a mistake. And I think that this chamber does right to reject it. Thank you.
Will you remark?